Well, if you were to need anything, you could probably find it back there at Tuckaway's General Store, here at the Shelburne Museum. But we're not here to go shopping, we're here to look at furniture. And there's some nice accessories and furniture right here. A butter churn, a nice cobbler's bench, and this piece is real interesting. It's a Canadian settle that converts into a bed. You flip it open like this, and I suppose you hop inside. Kind of unusual. And inside, there's a great kitchen table I want to show you. Now, over here is the piece I wanted you to see, this kitchen table. It couldn't be simpler. 2 wide pine boards for the top with a breadboard edge, some slightly tapered legs with some small stretchers connecting the bottom to make it stable, and some nice wide rails. And over on the other side, a couple storage drawers, well used as shown by this knob. Nothing fancy here, a rabbeted joint, simply nailed together. You know, a table like this could be used behind a sofa or as a library table. It makes a great kitchen work table, or you could use it as it's set up here to have dinner around. We've been looking for something just like this. Please read, follow, and understand all the safety rules that come with each of your power tools. Knowing how to use your tools safely greatly reduces the possibility of personal injury. And remember this, there is no more important safety rule than to wear these safety glasses. Now I'll show you how I built today's project. Here you see our rendition of that kitchen work table we saw at the Shelburne Museum. But there are a couple significant changes. One is the top. I chose cherry, a hardwood, instead of the pine. After all, this is a kitchen work table, and it's going to take a lot of use and abuse. And I think the cherry will hold up to that. And besides that, I think it'll look a lot nicer when it's finished. Another change was down at the bottom, at the base. Remember the one at the museum? It had a stretcher system that went all the way around the perimeter. And that's okay if you're going to stand and work at the table. But what about if you want to use chairs? You want to be able to store them, and you want to be able to sit there comfortably. So I took the stretchers that were along the front edge and removed them and replaced them with one stretcher down the middle. I think it'll be strong enough to hold the table together, and you'll be able to sit at it comfortably. Started today, let's glue up some boards to make the top. Well, I've just run all my boards through my joiner to straighten the edges. That's because I want a nice, tight-fitting joint between the boards. I don't want to have to try to pull any gaps together with my clamps. I want them to fit tightly without any pressure, just like that. Now also notice that I've put pencil marks about every 9 inches across the joint of the board. And that's because I'm not only going to use glue, but I'm also going to use these biscuits to help strengthen the joints as I join them together. Yeah. Now I'll put some more glue on the biscuits just before I join the boards together. Now the idea here is not to squeeze it so tight that all the glue comes out, just enough pressure to squeeze. You can see it just start to come out of the joint, and that should do it. I like to alternate my clamps under and over, and that tends to keep the top from cupping as it's clamped. The rails on my table are connected to the legs by a system known as mortise and tenon joinery. The tenons are on the rails, and they fit into these slots or mortises which are in the legs. Now, I'm going to use my router and a special little jig that I built. The leg will slide in through this tunnel. The key is this slot right here and this little collar that I've installed on my router in through which the bit spins. Now, you slip the collar into the slot, and as you can see, it can't move side to side, so that controls that movement. Then I've installed a stop here and one here, which controls this movement. And one last thing is the depth. And the router has these little pins you can adjust that control the depth of the cut. Now I slide the leg in through the tunnel. And you can see the tunnel is a little bigger than the leg itself. And then I hold in place with a couple edges pinned from each end. Mortises. And now I need another one along this edge. And to do that, I have to place it in the jig from the other end. Boy, that does a nice job. And by using the jig, I know that all the mortises are identical. Now what I've started to do is plow out the sides of the tenons. Now here we have two boards, the long rails for the table. And they've been clamped to the workbench so they won't move around. And I've attached this clamp straight edge combination as a guide. And it's used for my router. I ride the router against the straight edge to cut the tenon in the right place. Now the bit is the same one I used earlier, the 1/2" spiral bit, except this time notice I don't need a collar. Well, using the same setup, I've milled the sides of the tenons on the short rails. Now with the same kind of setup, except this time with the boards on edge and all four of them clamped together, I'm able to mill out the top and bottom of the tenon. Now the table at the Shelburne Museum had a couple storage drawers in it, and I think that's a good idea. And what they did is they actually cut the openings for the drawers out of the full-size rail. Not an easy job, especially since they probably did it with hand tools. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use my portable handheld jigsaw. That's perfect. Now, for purely aesthetic reasons, these legs are just slightly tapered. The taper starts just below the rail and tapers down to the bottom of the leg, about 5/8 of an inch overall, along this face and this face over here. Now to make the taper, I'm going to use my homemade tapering jig. And that's simply a couple pieces of oak that have a hinge at one end. And up at the other end here, there's an adjustment feature which gives me a whole bunch of different tapers. There's a little stop block against which the stock rests. And what you have to remember is that you always taper the side with the mortise, and you can't make a mistake. Watch. Let's take a look at the draw support system. It's low tech, but it works pretty well. There are two runners, one on each side of the draw, and they're made out of this stock. And what I've done is taken some 1-inch stock and cut a rabbet in it. The wide part of the rabbet is the place the draw rides on, and the narrow part of the rabbet on the side can left and right. Fasten these runners to the rails back here. I suppose you could nail through. You could drive some screws through at an angle. You could even make a nice mortise and tenon. But why bother with that when you have a biscuit joiner? Here I've got my rails set up with the layout for the runners. And note that where the rabbet is, the runner will stick above the drawer opening about 1/16 of an inch, and that's so that as I slide the drawer in, it'll clear the opening rather than rub up against it. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is cut the slots in the ends of the runners. Also note that I'm using a slightly smaller biscuit, and that's because I don't want it to stick out beyond the ends of the piece. And there's the indicator mark for my slot. Well, now we're ready for some sub-assembly. Just a little bit of glue on the tenons. Now I just slip it into that mortise and use my rubber mallet to just tap it into place. Okay, now I'm ready for a clamp. Okay, the idea here is not to put on too much pressure, just clamp it down enough to bring the joint tightly together. Now I'll just pin it in place with a couple dowels. Well, now for the short rails. The process is the same. Now, before I install the other short rail over here, I want to prepare the runners, a little bit of glue on each end and a biscuit. Okay, now with all the glue on everything, speed is of the utmost importance. Now, I can't put the rest of those runners yet. I want to start the tenons on my end rail here. Get that squeezed together a little bit. Now back to the middle. Okay, now see if I can get this last one in. Okay. Now for a few dozen clamps. Okay, that's the layout line for the short stretcher that connects the two legs. Now also notice that I've got a clamp up here, and that's because I want to make sure that the legs are parallel at their outside edges. So down here at the top of the table I've got 29 and 7/16, and up here I've used the clamp to pull the legs together so it's the same. Now remember, the legs are tapered along the inside edge. So in order to get an accurate scribe mark, I'm just going to hold my piece up and draw a pencil line. Now this is a cinch over here on the miter box saw. Now the angle, when I did the prototype, it was about 1 1/4 degrees, believe it or not, very slight. I'll set it at that, and I'll make a cut about 1/8 of an inch away from my line to see how it is, and if I have to, I'll readjust. That looks pretty good. Now we'll cut it for keeps. I've just cut the long piece of the stretcher system to length, and that was a 90-degree cut. Now I calculated that for our table, this stretcher piece was to be 62 1/4 inches. And that will go up here in the middle of this piece like that. Now I'm going to join this all together with biscuits and glue, but before I do that, I want to do one more detail. If you look at the prototype, the stretcher is chamfered along the top edge, both pieces. And I'll do that using my router set up with a chamfering bit. Okay, let's put it together. Now before I take it off the bench, there's one more thing I want to do. I thought I'd sand down these dowel pins. They're sticking out just a little bit. And to do that, I'm just going to use my little belt sander. Well, let's look at a couple more features back here at the prototype. One is these corner blocks, which add more stability to the base and also allow me a place to drill up from below and put some screws through to hold down the top. Also, I've got these pieces that run from rail to rail, It's pretty much centered on each draw. I can also use those to help hold the top down, but they're really there so that as you slide the drawer out, the back of the drawer will ride against it, preventing it from tipping out as you pull it out from the face of the table. Now the pieces are nothing special, just scrap 1x2, and these are 45-degree angles that I cut on the miter box, and no fancy joinery, just a screw and a little bit of glue on each angle, and that'll hold them in place. Now notice that I held them down a little bit, and that's so that when I put the screws in for the top, I'm assured that it'll be tight against the rails. Okay, that takes care of those. Now we're ready to make some drawers. It's pretty simple. It's flush all the way around, no lip. The front is 3/4-inch poplar. The side and the back are 1/2-inch pine. And the bottom is just a piece of 1/4-inch plywood. The front is joined to the side with these dovetail joints. I'll show you how I made those. I've already cut the front and side pieces to the correct length and width, and I've clamped a couple of them in this dovetailing jig, which is just a tool with a couple eccentric cams that hold the stock in place, and this template that makes the dovetails. You have to use a router, which has a collar and a dovetailing bit. Now the collar simply rides on the template in and out of these little pieces that stick out, cutting the tails and pins for the drawer. Pretty good. What I'm doing here is plowing a 1/4-inch groove in the side pieces and the drawer fronts to hold that plywood bottom I talked about earlier. And I'm using the table saw, which is set up with this single blade dado head cutter. It's actually like a wobble blade. It's set at an angle and it wobbles back and forth, plowing out the material. It does a pretty good job. Okay, that takes care of the groove for the plywood bottom. Now I'm going to readjust the width of the dado cutter so that it cuts a 1/2-inch wide dado. And I want to cut a dado down the side so that it receives the back piece. Now we'll just slip the bottom in. No glue here. The bottom may expand and contract slightly, and I don't want it to push the drawer apart, so it just kind of floats in there. Put a little glue in these side dados. Just slip the back piece in. And I'll drive a couple brads in through the end to hold it in place while the glue sets up. Now I'll just check the drawer for square, set a framing square on the bottom of it, and that looks good. Now just tack it in place along the back edge. I think the top turned out pretty well. You know, the combination of the biscuits and the glue do a great job to pull it together. But you always end up with a little bit of unevenness at the top of the boards. So now's the time for me to take my belt sander and smooth it out. Okay, now the next thing that I want to do is put a nice straight edge along each end of the top. And to do that, I'm again using my combination clamp straight edge, which is set down, and I'm just going to use my circular saw to trim it off. Okay, I've just made a tongue on the end of the tabletop. It's about 3/8 of an inch thick. And over that is going to sit the breadboard edge. Here you see it applied at the prototype. Now the tongue doesn't show through the end. So I'm going to take my little dovetailing saw and trim off about 3/4 of an inch. Okay, now using my router table set up with a 3/8 inch straight cutter, I'm able to plow a groove in the breadboard edge. And notice that I didn't let the groove go all the way through the end because I don't want that tongue to show. Now with the breadboard edges lightly clamped in place and working from the underside of the table, I'm drilling some 1/4 inch holes for some dowels that'll hold it on. And I'm not going all the way through, I'm stopping just short of that face side. Now with the edge removed, I want to elongate the 2 outboard holes so that the top can move freely as it picks up moisture and so forth. I'll just do that with a rasp. A little drum sander does a nice job rounding off the corners. Now I'll just slip it on there, dry, no glue. That's the whole idea, is to let it move freely. Lightly clamp it in place. Well, now I'm just going to put a little glue where the top edge of the dowel will be, just to hold it in place. And I'll drive it in, making sure not to hit it so hard that it might pop through the other side. That was a 1/4 inch radius rounding over bit I used to ease the edges, and now I'm ready for some final sanding. Well, about another hour or so of finished sanding, and I'll be ready to complete this project. I'm in no hurry to permanently attach the top, or even to put the knobs on the drawers, because I'm going to paint the lower section, the poplar parts, and I'm going to put 5 or 6 coats of oil on this top. You know, this poplar paints up beautifully. And what I'm putting on now is a latex enamel undercoat. And after it dries, I'll give it a light sanding and put on a couple coats of the finished color. Boy, doesn't this Danish oil finish with tung oil base do a beautiful job on this cherry? I think I'll put about 5 or 6 coats on, letting each coat dry overnight, and that should take care of it. It's going to look beautiful. Well, I think it's going to take another coat of this acrylic latex enamel before I get the finish that I want, but the color choice is perfect.